Vítám vás u další epizody podcastu Teorie poznání. A dneska bude epizoda trošku jiná, protože máme hosta, který nemluví česky, nebo mluví, ale nechce tolik mluvit česky. Nemluví, protože se nenarodila v Česku, je to Emma, která je původem francouzská, proto budeme mluvit anglicky, takže od teď přepínám do angličtiny, snad to nebude vadit. Emma, who is the guest today, is a Franco-Algerian fourth-year doctoral student and tutor in history at the University of Oxford and a visiting fellow at Charles University in Prague. And after obtaining a BA in politics, philosophy and German from UCL and a modern history master's from KCL, she has decided to specialize in environmental history of Central Europe and moved to Prague, where she is residing right now and while studying her PhD at Oxford. As part of her research on 19th century Bohemia and Moravia, she investigates the ways that landscape and environment shape identities, but she's also a huge World War I enthusiast. So today we're going to have these two topics covered, World War I and also how identity, and especially Czech identity, has been formed in the past centuries. So different topics than the previous podcasts, but exciting ones. So Emma, thank you for coming and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Good to have you. So let's start with what you call your pet project, which is World War I, a nice name for it. So World War I, why do you find the topic fascinating? Why do you like it?
I think that the reason that, I think that's kind of like maybe the wrong way to approach it. I think the reason why I chose to teach a course focused on the First World War at Discover specifically is because personally for me, I think this is the first kind of topic that we covered when I was in school that I got quite curious about. So personally for me, I think that's a topic that's quite important in my journey as a historian. And the second reason would be that it's actually a really good event to use to teach history because it's just at the crossroads of so many experiences and at the crossroads of so many branches of history that it just lends itself really well to the format of courses that we offer at Discover.
Okay. And so what are the main crossroads you are talking about?
So, first of all, there's kind of like the idea of what historians would call history from below. So it's looking at actual individual experiences from people who were part of historical events. So it's not just what you might be taught at school is, oh, this president or this prime minister decided this and this general decided that. And that's kind of a bit boring. So what we do instead is we look at individual soldiers' experiences or actually any individual's experience of that event. So that's one. The other would be the kind of people, the kind of individual that we decide to study, right? So we can look at a British trench soldier, or we can also look at a woman on the home front. We can also choose to look at a brown or black soldier, British or part of the colonial troops. We can look at military history, which is always a little bit of fun. So it's just really diverse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're actually going to talk about this a lot, about the little individual stories, because that's kind of what I think I'm most interested in today, because the high-level overview, that's what you can read or hear anywhere, but the little stories, those are quite interesting. And I think a bit more relatable then for the people when you actually read about the day-to-day experience of the people. You realize that they are actually people like you, and it's great to have the relation to them afterwards. So that's definitely one of the main topics we're going to discuss. But maybe just to kick it off a bit more high level. Mm-hmm. So why and how did actually World War I start? A little general overview.
Well, it kind of depends. That's one thing that we go over with my students as well, right? It's kind of like there are kind of like three layers. It's kind of like, there are three tiers, right? There is the immediate kind of spark like the most immediate cause, right? Which we all know is the assassination.
Yeah. By the way, don't hesitate to just repeat it. That's fine, because maybe some people don't know. Maybe some do. So it's fine if you repeat the information.
Okay. Great. So then you have the 28th of June, 1914, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And that kind of like kickstarts a chain reaction that ends with, a war declaration in August 1914. So that's kind of like, if you look at it from one angle, then you can dig a little bit deeper and be like, why go to war over the one person? Like, sure, you could, but you didn't have to, right? When you look at how complicated it all is and the involvement of so many countries. So then if you try to kind of understand why they went to war over this assassination, then you kind of look at competition over resources, you look at the self-perception and the images that all these different countries and leaders wanted to have, and you see kind of more of what is at stake, right? Which is kind of each country's standing on the world scene and how much power they had over each other. So the power balance. And then you have kind of like the third layer, the third element, which is a bit rogue, which is kind of like, why does anything happen? It's kind of just accidental in a way. And that's kind of, that's something that is worth thinking about, I think.
Okay, so do you think there are scenarios in other universes when it didn't happen, where it really was not inevitable for it to happen?
I do wonder, because, probably. In the infinite possibilities of universes, I think there is one where this war specifically did not happen, yeah. Okay. And definitely many where it did not happen the way that it did.
And what do you think would need to happen, to prevent it? And maybe both the short-term view or like the little view when obviously the assassination wouldn't have happened, but then also when you zoom out, for resource competition and the national clashes there, what could have been different?
You would have to go quite far back, I think, to be able to prevent it. Because another root cause for it, right, would be nationalism, which develops already at the end of the 18th century, right, with the French Revolution. So, that's a long way to go back to prevent something that happens more than 100 years later. But I think one thing that's key is kind of seeing the willingness of every country to kind of go ahead and, make this war happen. I think that's kind of like the most decisive factor, in my opinion, how ready people are and how they see this war as kind of the only way to resolve power struggles in Europe and in Africa. So that's a lot for it not to happen. So if you ask me this question, then I kind of think there are many evils that precede the First World War that you would need to prevent, that could prevent the First World War from happening. So there's kind of like an endless loop of then we should prevent colonization, and then we should prevent all of these other things from happening. And that's a little bit of a losing battle I think you're fighting when you...
But do you think that Germany actually had to lose, or was set to lose the First World War, or...
No, I don't think so. But I think, one of these, or when historians have written about Germany in the First World War and the reasons why Germany was defeated, they talk a lot about the Schlieffen Plan. Yes. And that's something that's decided before the war even happens. So already, you're looking at an event that precedes mobilization and kind of like a breakdown of diplomatic communications. And you're like, this is already a moment when Germany has decided a course for itself that is very tricky. So the plan, I don't know if you know about it. So the plan is, because Germany is kind of it's stuck between a rock and hard place, right? It's got France on one side and it's got Russia on the other. So it knows that it's going to have to fight two enemies at once on two different fronts. And that's kind of, I mean, just, I'm not a military strategist and you're not either, but that sounds like a very dire plan to anyone, or a very tricky situation. So what they decide to do is they decide to, that they're going to very quickly defeat France in like 6 weeks. And then they're going to go and attack Russia because Russia is kind of seen as backwards. It's going to take longer to mobilize. So if they're quick enough, they can defeat France, and then Russia will just have mobilized, and then they can attack Russia and be done with it. That's a plan that was extremely ambitious and tricky for many reasons. They had to walk through Belgium, German troops. That's tricky because Belgian neutrality was guaranteed by the UK. So there's that. It's also only 6 weeks to defeat a major military power, which is, again, like kind of very tricky. Like the timing of it was just a bit of a nightmare, you know, like there was no buffer. So does that mean that Germany was doomed from the beginning because of this strategic decision? I don't think so. But yeah, it's kind of interesting when you think about it that already the decision that's made by one military figure isn't going to influence the whole thing. So I don't know. I don't think it was bound to happen, Germany's defeat, but it makes sense when you look back to it.
And why did they actually fail to fulfill the plan and to meet the goals?
The main reason why it happened, I think, is because Britain used the excuse of them being a guarantor of Belgian neutrality to enter the war. So Germany is like, we're requesting safe passage through Belgium to attack France, and they're asking Belgian authorities, will you let us pass through? And Belgium says no. But they decide to go through anyway, knowing that Britain's behind Belgium. And so, so then Britain gets involved. It also, they needed to move a lot of people from Germany to the border with France, which was very complicated. So just a little bunch of details, that accumulate and snowball, and then at the end, you're not able to do what you deemed possible before.
And I mean, if they won, what would actually be the end goal there? Because I don't suppose they would want to capture, capture and keep France, right? And make them maybe Russia. So would they want to steal the colonies, or like get them to pay and I don't know, get some tribute resources, or what was the end game they were playing?
Mm-hmm. So Germany had kind of like two main projects, right? One was Mitteleuropa, so they wanted to have kind of like a massive geopolitical entity covering most of Europe, which would be German speaking. So that's one of the reasons they wanted to kind of establish their dominance unencumbered by other major European powers such as France and Britain and Russia, which would never let that happen, right? That's one thing that they had another project, which was Middle Africa. So that same, they wanted to kind of, because they had two German colonies on both African coasts, and they wanted to kind of like join them together, maybe get a little bit more as well, and take that from France and Britain. So that was one thing. And then they also had some kind of interest in the Middle East because of their allies, the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire also had some plans there that could benefit Germans. So but mostly, so it's mostly a war that's fought for gains outside of Europe. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough.
Oh, okay. But primarily in Africa, you say?
Yes, I think primarily in Africa. Most European
that's super
powers.
interesting that it was Yeah, the Africa was the main goal. I didn't know that.
It was one of them, right?
Oh, like yeah. But
the other one would be kind of deciding, because you have so many emerging powers, and like Germany is one of the most threatening ones to kind of like older powers, right? Because it's so it's industrializing really fast, the population is growing really fast, so kind of it's the moment when we are supposed to decide, or leaders back then were supposed to decide, who was going to become the next leading power in Europe. And so they come to head and they decide to fight over it and have a war to kind of see who emerges victorious.
And did they have any idea about what the US would do at that time, or were they just not considering them at all?
No, I think...
They were neutral at the time, right? Like not very neutral, but pretty much detached from anything happening.
Yeah, I think America at that point is just minding its own business.
Okay.
It's also, yeah.
Okay, so Germans didn't expect them to do anything.
I don't think so, no.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
But don't quote me on that.
Yeah, this is gonna destroy your academic career and people find out. Okay, so if we now zoom in from the high-level military and geopolitical view onto the stories of the little people actually in the war, which I guess are what do you mostly care about and what is the most interesting that we can discuss today. So what did the people actually think in people in European nations? So maybe they had different views, like based on the nation they came from. Did they hate each other? Did they want to fight? Like, were they so strongly nationalistic that this made sense to them?
I think, well, we should kind of start with this discussion with a little disclaimer, right? Which is that it is actually very difficult to know what everyday people thought. Because, if I think about you and me, how often do we record our thoughts in a way that is exploitable and makes sense? If you think about the fact that people in the past did that even or much less than we do now, you kind of end up with the issue of you kind of want to know who these people were, what they were thinking, what was important to them, but also they leave very little behind. But let's try it anyway. So I think, and it is quite, we know what newspapers and media in general were putting out there, right? Which was nationalistic, xenophobic rhetoric. So be a proud German, be a proud Frenchman, be a proud Brit, and hate whoever the enemy is.
And what would you hate about them? Like, because you have all these narratives about what the evil refugees are going to do and how different they are, but then you couldn't imagine that you would today write the same thing about a person from Germany, right? Because it's just so close, the culture. So how could they, like, what were the differences they mentioned there? Because like how different can you be, right? Like it's very similar. Was it at that time? I don't know.
So actually, I think during, like, right before the First World War, we actually are reaching one of the peaks in terms of what we would call, or what I would call, kind of ethnic categorization. So people will not only talk about kind of the white race and the black race in a colonial context. They would also speak about there is the French race and the German race and the British race, and even white people sought to differentiate themselves and consider themselves to be part of different racial groups, not only different cultural groups, but different racial groups. And then the kind of narrative that you could hear would be kind of diplomatic wrongdoing. Like there were two crises in Morocco between France and Germany before the First World War started. So that's the kind of things that you would have. And that's also why we kind of like, we have a difficult time understanding how strongly people felt about national identity before the First World War happens, because these are very kind of middle class educated concerns, right? Like how a German ambassador behaves is not the concern of the everyday man, you know? So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about xenophobia or just feelings of hostility amongst common people during the First World War.
Okay, so basically, you are saying that people saw each other as different race, which meant that like they saw other nationalities as basically alienated from what they are. That's super interesting.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I guess today you cannot imagine seeing someone from even someone very close from Poland or maybe Germany, France as a different race. That's such an abstract image. That's such an abstract idea.
Yeah. And they're creating, science to back this up as well. They're having all kinds of studies. Like one of the famous ones I think that most people are familiar with is like measuring, skull diameters.
Okay, so they were saying that they are different even physiologically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So physically as well. So like how tall people are, how big their heads are, the ratio that their different limbs are to their torso or to the rest of them. Like there's a whole kind of scientific community focused on just establishing the criteria for each different race. But the fact, regardless of whether people bought into this idea before the First World War, what we call quote unquote like common people, what you do notice is that once there is mobilization or once they realize, oh, okay, we're going to war with the Germans, in the French context, for example, they do very easily kind of take part in acts of xenophobia. So shortly following mobilization or the declaration of war against Germany in France, there is actually destruction of private property that is associated with individuals or businesses that have German-sounding names. So people who until then might have not thought about German people at all during their daily life, suddenly they're told, okay, we're going to go to war against the Germans. They're like, okay, I hate everything German now. They go out and they destroy factories, they destroy shops. And it's just kind of interesting to see how this is something that can be ignited in them, something that they might not have considered part of them before.
Well, I feel like you see that today pretty much as well. I'm always quite... Now, not anymore, I guess, but in the past few years, I've been quite surprised how easy it is for people to start hating someone for something that you wouldn't have thought just a couple of months before, or maybe, yeah. It's quite crazy, but I guess it's just part of human nature. So people... When we come back to the initial question, so did people want to fight? Were they ready to fight? Were they just, standing in front of the recruitment offices and, eager to become conscripts? Or were they annoyed that they would be recruited and they didn't feel like that?
Well, so it depends who people...
Yeah, who was actually recruited?
People are, exactly. So if you look at... It also depends on what country you're looking at because systems would be different, right? So, for example, in France, you had a kind of reserve-based system. So every young man from between the age of 21 to 23 was asked to serve in the military and receive military training. And once that was done, they would become reservists. So they would be part of the army, but they would have kind of a normal civilian life, but at any time they could be asked to join the ranks and go fight somewhere. So that's the French system. And so in 1914 you have mass mobilization, usually in age groups. So first they ask the younger men to come and join the army, and then as they need more men, they ask kind of like older and older reservists to join. If you look at the UK, where this system was not really, it didn't really work. There was a lot of pushback, so it was very different. So in the British system, it was kind of, I think until 1916, it was professional soldiers and volunteers. And then conscription comes into play in 1916. And then they're asking every unmarried man and every childless widower between, I think, the ages of 18 and 41. They give them 3 options, which is basically enlist, enlist, or enlist. They're like, you can enlist now, you can not do anything, and by default we'll consider you enlisted, which is great, great for the British Army. But if you look at the British case, of the 5 million people that joined the military, the 5 million men that joined the military during the First World War, about half of these were volunteers. So I think that's
a lot.
Yes. So that's about around 2.6 million British men were volunteers. So they willingly chose to go up and fight. Which doesn't mean that necessarily that they did fight or fought in the trenches.
I mean, it must have had pretty big economic benefits for them, no? Like at least for the poor ones to have some stable income, maybe food available in the army and so on.
Maybe they did think that, actually. All I know is that if they were hoping that the army would feed them, they must have been direly disappointed. But yes, there were definitely benefits to enrolling. There was, some of them did it out of a patriotic sense of duty. Some of them did it because they had aspirations to glory. Some others did it because of economic benefits. Others did it because of social mobility. So there are as many reasons as there were people, almost.
And do you know whether people could actually pay not to get recruited, just buy themselves out of it?
Yes. Yeah, you could be a kind of a richer man, or the son of a richer man, and kind of get away with some kind of position which or not end up in the army, or at the very least end up in a position that would be kind of risk or less risky than most people.
But you would need to pay for it.
Probably, or have connections.
Okay.
But like also lots of people get turned away who want to volunteer, right? Because back then it's very strict who is considered a fit soldier. And they have a list of conditions that kind of like already, it's like, no, like maybe if we're really, really desperate, we'll call you back. But right now we don't need you.
What would that be, for example?
So any kind of deformity. So that's a no. If your eyesight is not good enough, that's a no, obviously, right?
Great.
So, but also one of the issues, right, is that especially in the UK, lots of working class men are, they are not in the best shape because, unsurprisingly, being a middle class person in the UK before 1914 is not very good for you. So they're like malnourished, and they're just overall not fit to be part of the army. Tooth decay is another one, and like I don't think going to the dentist was particularly affordable or practical. So they overall want a fit army that's going to be able to serve its purpose and fight well, and some people just don't fit the bill, so they just get turned away.
Okay, so let's say the people already get recruited. So what does their day-to-day life look like?
So you would only spend a few weeks at a time in a trench, right?
As if you would rotate. Okay.
So you wouldn't spend months on end, or most soldiers' experience is not spending months on end in a trench. It's spending a few weeks at a time. And kind of like it's a bit of a paradoxical experience, right, that they have, because a lot of the time in the trenches is actually spent waiting. Either waiting to go over the top, as they say, or be sent out on an attack on enemy trenches, or waiting for a warning that the enemy is attacking. But most of the attacks are actually taking place very early in the morning, around dawn, or very late at night, because that's. And when a soldier, he writes about it. He's like, attacks only take place very early in the morning or very late at night when everybody is expecting it, which is when we're on where they say stentos, like when they're kind of asked to be ready and be their most vigilant selves and be on the lookout for the enemy. And then during nighttime, they patrol the trenches. They kind of try and investigate. They're on the lookout. They try to see what's happening in enemy trenches, if anything is kind of brewing over there. And they sleep during the day most of the time. And then, they don't attack all that often, because trench warfare is it's quite tricky, right? So to have successful trench warfare, you need two elements. You need the element of surprise, which, as the soldier that we've just talked about pointed out, clearly is not there. And then you need just sheer manpower. So you need a lot of soldiers, because it's very costly just to start kind of that offensive.
But should I really imagine the charge like we see it in movies, where you literally just climb out of the trench and you run?
Yes.
And
you
like
crawl.
everyone is shut down, and you hope that the numbers are large enough so some people get there.
Yes. Yes, that's what it's like.
It's brutal.
Yeah, because as I said, so it's very difficult to get out of your own trench. That's the moment when you're kind of like the most vulnerable, and then just run across a no man's land. It's full of crater holes and dead bodies, and to try and get into enemy lines and fight more there. But to go back to the daily lives of soldiers, so they don't attack all that often. A lot of the time they just wait for orders, they prepare, they watch, so they read, they play card games, they write letters to their families, and they are just constantly afraid as well, because all around them there's just bombing, shelling going on all the time. And they write about it. They're like, when we say shelling all the time, we don't mean every 15 minutes there's a bomb going on. We mean detonations almost all the time, all around you. So it's kind of this weird, there's kind of this in limbo between waiting but also being very much in the war zone.
Okay, so at every single moment you can get hit by a shell.
I mean, yes. I mean, you can hear them. Some detonations come from far away, right?
Oh, okay.
And some detonations are closer. The point is there is shelling going on all the time. Yeah. And there's, just life in the trenches in general it's not, I mean, as you can imagine, it's just not great. There's disease, it's dirty, it's muddy, it's wet. One of the main issues actually in the trenches are diseases. So
what kind of diseases?
So there is something called trench fever, which is due to kind of body lice that soldiers have. There are rats, a lot of them, that feed on rations. They also feed on dead bodies. It's really wet, so you can also get trench foot, which is, I mean, you don't need to know the details, but it's quite bad. If you want to know the details, then you can Google it. But it's very basic. It's extremely demanding on your body to be in a trench, because it's dirty, it's wet, and it's not the conditions the human body was meant to, thrive in.
Yeah. And what were the relationships between the soldiers? Were they getting along, or was there like a sense of brotherhood, or were they just taking advantage of each other, to get more rations, and were they bullying each other? I feel like, what was the social vibe in the trench?
Overall, the sense that I get from it, based on what I've been able to read, it seems it's quite a friendly atmosphere, actually, and soldiers have a lot of empathy for one another. One of these reasons, right, is like necessity, because they're in such close proximity and there really isn't anybody else that they can interact with. So, if you are mean to everybody, then you've got nobody to play cards with, which is all that you do until you're kind of like sent to risk your life. So, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Yeah, based on the letters that you read, it seems that they're all, doing their best to kind of like get along and pass time in a way that is rather pleasant.
Okay, so how did they pass the time? You mentioned they played cards a lot. Okay, wrote letters.
Yeah,
but
they read. They have chores to do, right? So there's like some better ones and some worse ones.
Did they have alcohol?
Yes, they did. Actually, if you look at what happens is, at least for British soldiers, right? First thing that they get is actually rum. So they wake up, they get ready. There is like the stento, which is like they prepare in case enemies decide to attack, and then they have rum. And then there's breakfast, and they wait, they do some chores. Maybe it's like, if they're really unlucky, it's cleaning the toilet or burying someone. If they're a bit more lucky, then maybe it's just checking your fellow soldiers' feet for trench foot. And then they eat whatever they're given. They wait, they sleep. Then they have more food.
What was the food? What did they eat?
That's a good question. I actually don't know. Some of them ate army food, cold, tinned, I would imagine. And some of them had food sent from home. So
you could do that. You could have packages sent from home, even to the trenches.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But I don't think that was the norm, to have, your mom or your fiance pack you a lunch and have it delivered to the trenches.
Yeah. No, actually thinking how much they could communicate with their close ones, like how regular that was, because I don't know, where a car came every month to pick up the letters, to deliver packages. So how that logistics between home and soldiers worked.
There are several things here, right? The first is you can write as many letters as you'd like, but then you do need somebody to come and deliver them. That would be highly dependent on where you're writing from, right? If you're writing from kind of a station a bit more inland, then that might be easier than if you're actually on a trench, like that I would say, like what I would call an active trench, right? Where like you're really stressed, you're really under a lot of pressure because this is an active kind of front line. So then that might be a bit trickier. You're also not free to just write whatever you want, right? So you have people whose job it is to open your mail.
All of them? Or was it random? Or they check?
No. They check all the mail.
Really? Yeah.
They check the mail and they look at what you've written. And if there's any information that, if intercepted, could compromise military strategy, like you say, oh, we're here and we're going there, that's a no. It cannot go through. If you say, I'm really sad and I think we're going to lose, this does not go through. So even if you do write a letter, it gets picked up if censors read it and they deem it inappropriate, it doesn't go through. So your family never gets it. Same on the other side as well, right? You cannot just write anything that's going on in the home front because you don't want soldiers to lose morale. So if you say like, yeah, we're really low on food, it's actually really like, we don't like this, this is terrible, it's not coming through to the soldier. So like, there are many obstacles that stand in the way of communications between the home front and the front lines.
But then how can you use the letters, as historical kind of evidence of what happened or do we have even those that the census took and, withheld? Or
yes,
because,
yes.
Okay.
Because they, censors or whoever, they kept the letters that were intercepted and deemed unfit. Sometimes they would stamp them, did not make it through or unfit to go through, and then they would store them somewhere. And these are archives that we have access to now. So we know what some of the things are that didn't go down well, and we know what they said, even if their families never did.
Mm-hmm. And the final question I had about the life in the trenches was, what kind of equipment and even clothes and arms did the soldiers typically have? Like, was it good enough, or was it generally a bad level?
It changes a lot, right? Because you have during the First World War, we noticed the introduction of a lot of new military equipment. So at the very beginning, you still have soldiers that use bayonets. By the end, maybe you have fewer of them. At the very beginning, you don't have any protective equipment against chemical weapons, so gas, and then that's introduced. At the very beginning, soldiers don't necessarily wear helmets. About halfway through the wars, they start being required to wear a helmet, which some of them don't because it's like this clanky, heavy kind of metal.
It's not cool.
Doesn't look cute. So it changes a lot. There's also the infamous, French military, the French soldiers start the war in like bright red trousers, which when you're fighting trench warfare is not the best because the enemy can spot you really easily. So then that changes.
The French did it?
Yeah.
That's I'm not surprised that it was for the French out of all nations.
So some countries are like smarter, from the beginning. They use khaki or grey or anything that's kind of like a bit less conspicuous. But so there's a lot that changes during the war. There's also, I think, during the First World War, we start introducing body armor, which we didn't really before because we're realizing that a lot of injuries that disable or even kill soldiers could be prevented if what they wear was a little bit sturdier, right? But some of it you just can't help. Like machine guns are introduced during the First World War, and that's just something that any human being with a human body, even armored with metal, can't do much against. So yeah, it's quite intense, the kind of artillery and like weaponry in general that these First World War soldiers are exposed to.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned gas.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was the soldier, I think I would be completely scared of getting gas. That must have been a nightmare. Or were they aware of how bad, like how that it was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, gas is not very lethal. Like I think 1% of deaths during the First World War is due to gas. So actually the main point of using gas in trench warfare during the First World War is the fear factor. That's also why actually it's banned in the 20s, I think, because it's psychological warfare. It's incredibly painful to be on the receiving end of a gas attack. And at the beginning, it's also, these are brand new. So at the beginning, you don't really know what the gas is going to do to you. And it's kind of like trial and error. that kind of enables military higher-ups to kind of devise mitigating measures against gas attacks. But most soldiers, they're just scared. It's incredibly painful and it's debilitating, but it doesn't kill you, which is kind of also
and what did
very,
it do?
very cruel.
And what did it do to you? So it just, you were choking on it, or?
So there are different kinds, right? So you have chlorine, you have phosgene, I think, you have mustard gas, and depending on the gas that is used, it's going to have a different effect, right? So some of these gases, the effects are immediate. Some of these gases have effects that, or you only see the kind of consequences up to 48 hours after they've been used. Some of the effects last 30 minutes, others are lifelong impediments. Some of them burn, some of them suffocate you. So it's also, it's a lot. So mostly when you use gas, you use it for the fear factor. And also because, it's trench warfare. Trench warfare is stressful, it's exhausting, it's boring. So basically it becomes a war where it's not only about military strategy, because there is little that you can do, right, in a trench situation where, as we've said, you need the element of surprise and just a lot of bodies. It's all about psychology and morale and who's going to be worn down. And that's why people argue Germany lost in the end, is because it was worn down both in terms of resources but also in terms of morale. That people just didn't see the point in it anymore. It was exhausting. And they were like, why are we doing this again? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And yeah, this was actually the question I had as the next one. How did the people actually feel during the fight? Whether they felt like this was completely pointless and that they didn't want to be there, because I know one thing is to conscribe and be patriotic. Well, then when you are in the actual warfare, that I guess that's a whole different experience. And I read some studies, I think it was from the U.S. Army, about how a massive percentage of people actually were not shooting in the enemies. They were just shooting in the air because they didn't want to kill people, right? They were just they didn't want to do that. Actually, then U.S. Army saw this as a massive problem in later wars, and like with each war they were improving this through training, and then got to like 95% or even more in the wars today. So
wow.
Yeah. But even in Vietnam it was not more than like 70%, I think even less. But yeah, how did people feel about killing random guys from another country and then just being frozen in the trench, and weren't they asking, what do we do this for?
Yeah, they did. So eventually, even if you're incredibly patriotic, your patriotism kind of like peters out after a few months fighting in the First World War. And so you have mutinies, right? You have soldiers that kind of rebel and are like, well, I don't see the point. I don't want to do it. Like I've gone over, I've gone over the top like many times, and every time it doesn't work. We just end up having to retreat, and it's only for a few meters. And what's the point of it anyway? And so there are two kind of main ways that is dealt with. The first is kind of, it's just a threat of violence. So if you take part in a mutiny, you are shot. You're shot by your fellow soldiers because there just is no room, right, for you cannot threaten the way that the army is organized when the situation is already so difficult, right? So you have to be very harsh and react very quickly when there is kind of the when you can feel that dissent is brewing. So a lot of these men are shot if they decide that they want to rebel and they don't want to fight. And then the other thing that you do is you kind of, which is whether or not it was successful is a bit difficult to say, but you kind of peer pressure them, right? And you say, are you going to be a coward and not fight?
Yeah, that's my nice macho culture. Love it.
I mean, masculinity plays a massive role in war in general, and the First World War is no exception. So the way that men are viewed, the way that men are expected to behave, what masculinity means, what values it represents, how it should be, or how they should be upheld. There is an entire, narrative that's going on about that between 1914 and 1918, before that and beyond as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what was the mental state of the soldiers, both during the war and after the war? How, were they slowly, falling into madness, and like how many of them managed to recover from it after the war ended?
So I'm not sure that we have exact numbers on that. I certainly don't have them. But so we've covered boredom, we've covered fear, we've just covered resentment at being asked to fight a war that eventually you realize is not really yours and you don't really have a stake in necessarily. And then there is what is coined in 1915 shell shock, right? Which now we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that affects quite a lot of people. And actually that's what makes me say that soldiers had a lot of empathy towards each other, because so they live in this like hyper-masculine context, right? Where they're told like cowardice is bad, you're a man that should be patriotic, and you're a man that should be strong and aggressive and assertive and kill another fellow human being. But they're like, they see how some of their fellow countrymen or even other people that are fighting on their side, how their mental state, how their psychology is deeply affected by the war, and how some of them just go limp when they hear shell shock, when they hear shelling. Some of them just fall to the ground. Some of them have terrible stomach cramps. They can't move. And that's not just kind of infantrymen, right? That's also commanding officers. So most of people who fight in the war actually end up being shell-shocked, which is why doctors actually end up making a distinction between two kinds of shell shock. Shell shock wound, they call, and shell shock sick. So at the beginning they think, okay, what could be this like weird condition that seems to be affecting our soldiers in all kinds of ways, right? Some of them shake like leaves, some of them go really pale, some of them have stomach cramps, some of them, collapse to the ground. What's happening? And they think, it's because of the shelling, the vibrations, they get some kind of like head trauma from the vibration from the shells exploding. So they think that shell shock is actually a physical wound. And then they realize that some people are shell shocked that have never been exposed to shelling. And so these people are shell shock sick. And when you have shell shock or PTSD, you're not really fit to fight, depending on how severe it is. So actually some of these people are sent to rehabilitation centers. The issue is our understanding of psychology back then was not the best. So the kind of therapies that we have available some of them are decent. So there's the beginning of kind of like, I don't know the technical term for it, but therapy when you just have a chat with somebody to kind of talk about what happened maybe, or talk about something else. whatever helps. And then you also have occupational therapy, so kind of like filmmaking, painting, drawing, these kind of things. So that's kind of like a good side. And then the bad side is kind of what you see in horror films, like electroshock therapy and hydrotherapy, so like really cold or really hot baths, that kind of stuff. And that's like, unsurprisingly, 80% ineffective. But after a while, most of these people end up, because they're shell shock sick, sent back to fight more. And then that's when you read accounts of fellow soldiers being like, it was just awful seeing them in the state that they were in, and we were all scared, but we were all trying to hide it because you didn't want other people to see how scared you were, but these people, they just couldn't hide it. And they were messes. And they write about these, PTSD victims with a lot of empathy.
And after the war, how were they impacted in their normal life? Like, could they? What was the? It's obvious that they had psychological struggles, but how did it limit them in their normal living, be it with their family, with their friends, in their work?
So, I think, so if you look at PTSD or shell shock in particular, that would kind of, very much like today, if you have a strong trauma related to kind of war, that can seriously hinder your ability to reintegrate into society. Some of these people do not manage to reintegrate into society. Some of these people kill themselves, go out of work, end up homeless, or, with issues related to addiction. Some of them barely hang on, but there is no therapy to speak of that's widely available. So, it's kind of like either you hope that it goes away or you learn to deal with it, but it doesn't really go away. That's one thing. But another thing is, a lot of people also their bodies are not the same after the war, right? So shell shock is one thing. The other thing is all the people that end up amputees or just generally mutilated because of their experience of going through the war. And that can mean missing one arm, missing both legs, or that can also mean having a face that doesn't look human anymore because of the kind of injuries that you sustained, either at the end of a gun or at the end of a bomb. And for these people, it's incredibly difficult because after the end of the war, people are keen to forget because it was so horrifying. And having a face that is a constant reminder of what happened is not tolerated very well by society in general. So for these people, they kind of carry the double burden of reminding people of something that they would like to forget, and also not looking like they should, which ostracizes them even more. So the lives of soldiers after the First World War is very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Let's now jump into the second topic that we have here, but that's also related to the First World War. But that is what you yourself, I guess, like exploring the most, and those are the feminist and post-colonial or colonial lenses of how to look at war. So the fates of the people who we don't talk about at all, or basically at all. So the people from the colonies who were participating in the war as well, and in the war as well, but women who were not participating directly so much, I guess, but were still pretty much involved during and after. So what are the fates of those people? So let's start with the people in the colonies, maybe.
That's a nice question. So most of when I've spoken about soldiers up until now, and unless otherwise specified, I meant kind of a white European soldier. When you look at the experiences of colonial soldiers, that already is different from the moment that they decide to enroll, right? So a lot of them are forcibly conscripted into the army. That's notably the case in France, and some of the accounts that detail kind of like the capture, basically, of young men in Africa is very reminiscent, some historians argue, right, of slave captures, you know, in centuries preceding. So these, at the very beginning, they're asked, you know, would you like to fight? And some of them are keen to do it, again, for a variety of reasons, right? Some of them see glory, some of them feel patriotic. Some of them are also, you know, promised a lot of things that they're actually not going to get. So some of them are promised more civil rights or a passport, things that will technically allow them to have a better life after they're done waging war. So that's one case, right? And then you have people who are kind of like forcibly recruited and are actually, you know, taken away from their homeland and end up on a front somewhere fighting for colonial powers that have colonized them before. So already that is different from the what European soldiers experience. And then also the task that they're given and where they're sent, all of that is different, and all of that is colored by kind of European leadership's very racist and sometimes outlandish views. So one anecdote that always, like, it makes me laugh in a really sad way because of how absurd it is. But for example, when the French place an order for military shoes for their black colonial troops, there's what they call, you know, tirailleurs sénégalais, or like Senegalese soldiers. They order these massive shoes because they imagine that these African soldiers are going to be, you know, quote unquote savages who run around barefoot, and because they run around barefoot, they're going to have these massive feet.
They literally ordered the shoes, like
they placed an order, and then these soldiers arrive and they realize that they're actually normal men with like the normal, you know, distribution of shoe sizes, and that's a problem. So that's one, for example. But there are many more. You know, I think up until 1916, the French sent their colonial troops to southern France during the winter because they think that, you know, African soldiers are not going to be able to fight during winter because they're going to be debilitated, completely useless in the face of the cold. So that's kind of a positive.
And did these people care about the war, about the colonial powers? Like, did they care
Some
about...
of them did, yes. There is... I've forgotten his name, but I can find it for you. I think his last name is Diallo, for sure. Baka? Something like that. And he actually volunteered to go and fight for France because he actually really strongly believed in French superiority and upholding like French values and all of that. So he actually willingly went in this. And his is like kind of almost basically scenario, you know, like he goes willingly to fight because he genuinely believes that he should defend the colonial motherland. And then he gets shot in the arm, I think, and he's honorably discharged not even a year, I think, after he starts fighting. And then he receives a pension for the rest of his life, and he even wrote a book about his experience. So that's kind of the best you can hope for if you're a black colonial soldier in 1914. But then a lot of tales are different, right? So then you have people who are forcibly recruited, who are told to fight, and some of the actually white European soldiers on the French side, you know, they note, the Senegalese soldiers have arrived today, we know that means that we're going to go over the top and we're going to go and attack, because they're always sent first, which is the most dangerous position, right?
Yeah, that's actually what I was about to ask, whether that was, this sort of racism, where they would be sent for the most dangerous tasks, or what they would be, not maybe trusted with some of the more confidential or like it's a sophisticated task, and then day-to-day racism, whether it was existent and whether they actually fought side by side with the European white soldiers, or whether they were in completely separate groups. Like how about this division?
No, they did fight. They did fight side by side. They weren't. Most white soldiers, I think, the vast majority, did not consider colonial soldiers to be their equals, but they were, cordial, curious, because most of them would not have met, these colonial soldiers if it weren't for that specific context. And some of the tasks that colonial soldiers were tasked with were kind of harsher and more unfair, right? Like being sent to go over the top first. That's also good. But then it's kind of interesting how ambivalent military leadership could be, and basically they used them to whatever advantage they could. So they send them over the top first, but also they used them as police because they were incredibly obedient. So they used them as police in military camps sometimes to like police other soldiers as well.
By the way, did the white soldiers obey?
Apparently yes, because they did use these colonial troops to maintain order around camp. So
that's super interesting.
Yeah,
super interesting. Yeah, but I can still imagine that it must have been quite a shock for the colonial soldiers, because I know you say at least the French discharged them for winter in the beginning. I don't know whether later as well, but still, I guess if you come from Senegal or from Congo, from similar countries, and you come to fight in a trench near Belgian borders, and then it gets muddy, it gets wet, and like it's cold, and it must have been a completely out of this world experience for these people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of them have never set foot on European soil, right? It's their first time, and all that they see is kind of military settings. So they're at camp, they're stationed somewhere, they're in the trenches. So yeah, it's very different from what they're used to.
And do you know whether this experience influenced their pro or anti-colonial sentiment once they came home after the war?
Not on a general, not in any general sense. No. So I've read some accounts of some soldiers that still wrote in defense of colonial powers that they belong to, and some that it turns out became, very anti-colonization. So it's very individual, and I'm not quite equipped to name a trend one way or another.
Then what about the women then? What about the women and the wives, the mothers and daughters of the soldiers? What did they do actually when your man leaves? And I guess those were at the time mostly stay-at-home women, right? Like not so many women worked at that time, so that must have been quite a change.
Well, it's it also depends on what kind of woman you're asking about. So women were already in employment before. If we look at Britain, here, we're already in employment before the war started, and mostly in kind of more unofficial work that they could do from home, like fixing clothes and the like, but also in actual factories, in shops. Teaching, lots of female teachers. The issue was that it was looked down upon for a married woman to work. So a lot of these professions had marriage bans, so you could not continue to work after your wedding. In some cases, some employers, even from the moment you're engaged, would say that you can no longer work for them. So sometimes women just remain engaged for a really long time. Some women would lie about the fact that they're engaged or married. So that's one thing, right? So
what was the reasoning behind this norm?
I think it was, I'm not quite sure, but if I had to guess, I think it's just kind of the patriarchal bourgeois values of the time, right? That the man should be able to provide, that a woman belongs at home, and that it was understandable in some cases for an unmarried young woman to work, but a married woman should just be focused on family. And also, these ideals were very much class dependent, right? Because that implies that you marry somebody who is rich enough to provide not only for themselves, but also for you and your children. And that is just unrealistic for a lot of working class people at the time. That's why they're engaged in some kind of income generating work, whether outside or within the home.
So what did the day-to-day life of women look like? And I know you differentiate by social class, especially, but during the war. So did they start working, officially, or like did they need to provide for the family, or were the governments just paying them some sort of subsidies to take care of them while the men are gone, or what did they do? Did they support the war in some way, manufacturing arms or
So we've talked about what women were doing before the war. If we look at what women were doing after the war, some of them decide to join the war effort, right, in a very direct way. So either by becoming nurses or by becoming paramilitary workers. So that could be, depending on the training that they have and the opportunities they're given, kind of driving cars that are taking equipment to and from the front lines. That could be becoming kind of a mechanic and fixing some military equipment. So these things. And then some women are asked to contribute to the economy and to the war effort by kind of replacing the men that are away, right? So that's when you kind of notice the emergence, again, in the British context, of like a lot more women in public spaces. Then you have female policemen, you have female ticket inspectors, female street cleaners. And before that was exclusively for men, because men were allowed in public and women were at home or hidden in factories. So that's what they do if they decide to work or if they need to work for financial reasons. And then if they're more well-off women, then they might decide to contribute to the war effort in different ways. They can host charity events. They can get involved in some kind of social movement, like helping other women by kind of helping create more nurseries. They can reconvert their home in private rehabilitation centers. So women do get involved. I mean, again, this would be like white European women. They do get involved in a variety of ways based on their personal beliefs and their kind of socioeconomic background.
Mm-hmm. And how did they handle the men once they come back? Once they came back, that must have been quite a shock with all the PTSD, with all that with all the shock they've endured. How did the families function after that?
I actually have not read that many accounts of, experiences after the war, either from women or from soldiers who return home. So yeah, I don't have direct knowledge from these people, but the trend definitely was that gender roles, which up until then had been more or less clear-cut and straightforward, had really been turned on their heads, right? Because, ideas of masculinity and femininity had been challenged and redefined in different contexts, right? And depending on whether you were at home or you were on the front. So there definitely, at least on the part of government, and here I'm thinking specifically of the British government, there was a lot of concern about whether women had become too masculine and men had become too feminine. One of the hypotheses that they had actually for shell shock at the very beginning, actually, I'm not sure it was only at the very beginning, was that actually shell shock was due to the fact that soldiers in the trenches were just asked to be very passive. And passivity is not a quality that's associated with masculinity, it's a quality that's associated with femininity. And actually, by having these men sit around and play cards and be passive in trenches all day, you were basically traumatizing their masculinity, and that resulted in shell shock.
Nice.
I wish I was kidding.
Nice.
So, you have these hyper militarized definition of masculinity, and then you have these women who are kind of feeling a little bit more empowered. They're having a taste of what it's like to be visible in public. They're also having a taste of responsibility, right? They're getting money, they're getting paid. Some of them even go on strike. I think it's in 1918. I don't remember who exactly, but a group of women went on strike because they realized they were not paid the same as the male worker doing the exact same job. And they were like, same work, same pay. We want the same pay. So they went on strike for a little bit. And I think eventually they got a raise. They didn't get equal pay, but they got a raise. So, and so when you put these groups back together, the fear is, right, that you have effeminate men who are also weaker, some of them, right, because they're traumatized, because they're now have physical disabilities, and women who are overly independent and maybe also, let's say, promiscuous sometimes. That's also a real concern. So there is a bit of a backlash in the UK after 1918, where it's okay, now all the women go back home, all the men go back to work, and everybody can be happy like we were in 1913. Pretend that none of this happened, and women be good women and men be good men, and please have lots of children because we lost a lot of men during the First World War. That's kind of what happens. What happens afterwards. So I'm not sure whether this fear was justified, but there definitely were some women that had a taste of financial independence and wanted more of it, and also wanted more political and economic rights. And then there were some men that just were unable to live up to definitions of masculinity for a variety of reasons, because of what they'd gone through during the First World War.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it is important to study the story of these, marginalized or little groups, or maybe little stories that didn't define the course of the war?
You mean, why do I think it's important to study the story of individuals?
Yeah, and especially the individuals, that were actually not maybe taking part in the war, in the trenches, right? Or individuals that were not not the majority group, right? Which were, for example, these colonial soldiers, or the women, right? Which were not like directly involved there most of the time. Sometimes they were, so they are the minority there. Why do you think, it's important to voice these stories, but even the individual ones actually of the soldiers?
Well, I think part of the reason why I like to teach my students about it is because it's really horizon broadening for them, but it also teaches them to think about history in new ways, right? Because the kind of sources, or like primary sources like texts or photographs or letters, postcards, etc., diaries that we have available for white European soldiers are not going to be available for white European women or for colonial soldiers. So it kind of gets them to think about history as a man-made kind of phenomenon, right? So history is it's not purely factual, and it's not just the true version of what happened. It's kind of what we could reconstruct based on our interests and what was available to us. And I think that's really important that most people, especially most young people, understand this, because it helps them also identify power imbalances and power relations in society today. If you start thinking about why you can read a love letter between Vera Brittain and Roland Leighton, maybe it will prompt you to ask yourself, why can't I read, a love letter between an Indian soldier and his wife? What's happened there? And it really prompts everyone, really, and me as well, right, to think more deeply about the whole system in which we are writing history and in which history was made before the entire context. So I think it's really enriching in that way, not only because I think I'm as somebody who is a historian, I love learning about the past. I find it fascinating, and the more I can learn, the happier I am. But also I think it teaches very important critical thinking skills, for sure.
So when we look back at the First World War, what do you think we should take away from it? What do you take away from it when you look back at it? And it can be about individual humans, about humanity in general, about human nature, or about anything.
I was thinking about this actually because when you sent me the questions, I was like...
I don't send the exact questions. I just send the question areas.
Yes, when you send the things, I was like, oh, that's a difficult question. And then I started thinking about it more, and I think there are so many things, but at the same time, I wonder how many of them are specific to the First World War specifically. I think something that's definitely specific to the First World War is like the communication breakdown. When you first asked me, what are the reasons, or why did the First World War happen? One thing that I mentioned very briefly was breakdown in communication, because it's not a bunch of ambassadors or presidents and prime ministers phoning each other, being like, hey, so are you ready? My troops are stationed here. Shall we coordinate on declaring war on this third country? It's not happening like that, right? So everything is happening so much more slowly, but also people who want war to happen are using that definitely to their advantage, right? It's not just, things are going so slowly, so that's why it takes so long for the war to actually happen as we know it happened. Yes, that's true, but also people are purposefully waiting days to send communications that they've already got ready and prepared, because they know that, for example, this specific person is going to be traveling, and traveling takes a really long time back in the day, so they know that they will not have time to coordinate or even like have an emergency meeting, etc., etc. So I think that's one thing that I'm thinking of, you know, like that breakdown in communications, and also exploit, like the people who are willing to exploit these weaknesses in the system to serve their own interest or their versions of the truth and what is right. I think that's quite important to understand.
And, you know, one question that I know you are thinking about this one, but I've been thinking about it for quite a long time. And that is not exclusive to the First World War. And that is that, you know, in general, there's a big pattern that all the crises we go through as humans and as humanity are always really harmful in the short term. And of course they are. And, you know, here probably even in the long term for the soldiers who came out of the shock that lasted until they died. But that also, you know, that there's a general pattern of innovation thanks to or due to crises, right? Mm-hmm. Because and wars are especially strong in this because both or all the sides need to innovate scientifically, need to innovate technologically, and there are also social innovations, right? Just the ones you mentioned. So how the role of the women changed, right? And for the better. So, you know, my idea is, what if the short-term negative impact is actually exceeded by the long-term positive impact? What do you think about that? And I mean, I have the same ideas, but, you know, I have the same idea with COVID here. You know, so many people died because of it. It's true, but, you know, it accelerated the development of mRNA vaccines, which are like that's an extreme breakthrough for humanity, right? Like this is gonna save tens or hundreds of millions of lives, and they have. For every crisis, you have an example like that, right? So like raise arms during the arms race during the Cold War, and space exploration led to like technologies like GPS, and then even the touch screen for smartphone. That's all because the US and the USSR were racing whoever is armed better, right? So. What do you think about this? Like, what were the positive impacts of World War One?
Yeah. So I think, I think overall we can just agree that I don't think the positives are worth whatever happened. Right? At the end of the day, you have however many, 20 million soldiers and civilians died. Eventually, at the end of the day, it was to uphold a colonial system that cost the lives of many more people. So I don't think there is a way that we can say, oh, these positive developments or these positive contributions are worth the event in this case. But they definitely were positive quote unquote contributions or good things that happened, right? So like from gas that we spoke about earlier, now we have fertilizer, right? One of the gases, actually the chemicals in it and the way that they react, that enabled us to actually produce more food. So I guess that's one positive. And then the other positives would be mostly in the field of medicine and psychology. So we've mentioned occupational therapy, that's one of them. But then we also have blood transfusions, that becomes a lot more widespread, and we become a lot better at it because of the need to rescue hemorrhaging soldiers during the First World War. We also have kind of tourniquets, or how do you call it? When you
pressure measuring or what?
No. You know when you when you tie like something.
I never did in Czech.
Okay, wait.
Škrtidlo in Czech.
Actually, I have some notes from my class.
Arm strangler also.
Exactly. No, I don't remember what it's called.
I said it in Czech anyway, so people will know what it is, because no one beyond the Czech Republic listens to this anyway. So,
but then we also have X-ray.
all right.
The development of X-ray. That's really cool. We even have they're called Marie Curie cars on the front line. So they're cars equipped with X-ray machinery, so you can understand what's wrong if somebody has what's happened to a soldier very, very quickly, and that saves a lot of lives. Then there is antiseptic. We develop a lot. I think the main one would be Dakin, the Dakin solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so that reduces infection a lot more, right? One of the main reasons that people die during the First World War, the first is hemorrhaging, because combat is so violent, so people lose a lot of blood. And then it's sepsis, or infection. So we kind of find ways to make these less likely by improving the speed at which we can diagnose and solve a problem through X-ray, Dakin solution, tourniquet, so kind of wrapping some kind of band to stop bleeding from your arm or leg, this kind of thing. There's also anesthesia, because we start to have to operate on soldiers. Then we come up with new and more humane ways of doing that, and putting them to getting them unconscious for a little while. So that's something. And then we mentioned people who are mutilated, whose faces don't look like human faces, or don't look like they used to. Then we have also this kind of proto-plastic surgery that's emerging at the time, of facial reconstruction, which I think is it's pretty cool, making people look and feel better. So these are a few things that happened thanks to the First World War.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the final question for First World War: when you look at the crazy videos when they're from Ukraine now, when they are the exact same trenches, when that are with the exact same mud, and the soldiers were freezing in the trenches and fighting in some regions the exact same war that was fought 100 years ago. What is it? Does it make you feel something when when you studied this sort of war so much, and now you basically see it in real time, the exact same thing? Because obviously it's not the same, but it's so similar. You can see so much of the fighting from the trenches, when the people are just when the soldiers are just stuck there, and they do nothing all day. They're just bored. They just watch over the enemies, and the positions get more and more fortified now. So this is becoming more and more prevalent. It gets shelled over all the time. Basically the same.
Mm-hmm. And also the fact that some of them are not or a lot of them, if not most of them, are not professional soldiers, right?
A lot of them.
I think it just prompts me to ask a question that you already asked before, right? Which is kind of why are these people fighting? What are they fighting for? What's keeping them motivated? And I think both in the case of the First World War, and I think in the case of Ukraine, one of the reasons is nationalism. And to me, as somebody who studies nationalism and knows that it's knows what it actually is, which is an ideology that is very modern and only emerged quite recently, right? We're talking in the 19th century, which for a historian, 200 years ago, that's not that long. It's kind of baffling the hold that the idea of national community has over people. And I think that's something that is worth us reflecting about.
And actually that's a good bridge to the next section we want to talk about, which is about identity, right? And about national identity specifically. So, and actually I think Ukraine is a good example of this, because on one hand you have the Russian national identity, which is at least to some extent a culprit to this. The narratives they have been repeating for the past decades, that have kind of concluded into this narrative that they are the rightful like owners and masters of the region, and they should be obeyed. And then, but then also a negative, it's clearly negative example of national identity. But then you have also the Ukrainian narrative, and like the strength of their patriotism, allowing them to actually fight back bravely and like exceed the expectations, but by a large margin. So, how do you perceive national identity? Is that something that is negative? Is that something that's positive? Is there place for it in today's world?
I think I view it in more of a neutral sense. I definitely do think, and that's also one thing that I try to teach young people that I interact with. I think it's worth all of us reflecting on how pervasive nationalism is, and how one of the most powerful thing about it is that it makes you believe that nations are just they are through time, they are given, just like there are 7 continents. There are, however many national identities and national groups. And I think that's kind of a very dangerous idea when we see how nationalism is used as a tool to justify war and suffering. I think that's something that we should all be thinking about quite seriously, which is, what is national identity? What is its point? Why is it there? Why does it exist? Why do we all subscribe to this system, right? I think these are all important questions to ask ourselves. And I don't think it is possible to unsubscribe from the idea that, we belong to a nation, because it's just something that we're thinking from the moment you're born. There's just something that is ingrained in you. But I think there's something that could be done there. There's definitely room for improvement.
But don't you think there are also plenty of positive aspects the national identity can actually entail, right? So when you have truly positive values, like as the core of the identity, and then be it love, social cohesion, maybe, openness or tolerance, and you really see that as this is the basis of who we are. Doesn't that help? Isn't that kind of useful and helpful when you ingrain this into people's identity on their own?
I guess you could make a case for that. I'm not quite sure that it would offset the negative effects that nationalism has and has had in the past. But I do think one of the thing that is quite good about it is the sense of kinship and solidarity that it kind of is supposed to trigger in people, right? So like, you should help somebody who's a Czech person in the Czech Republic if you're a Czech person as well, and they might have been born less lucky than you were, right?
And what I'm also thinking is that, okay, we see the bad outcomes of this when today many people use national identity as something they hold on to and they want to protect, right? But on the and against maybe the outsiders and keeping it for themselves. We saw that during the migration crisis in Europe, that was pretty strong. But I also think that for many of the people, like it's sort of the last thing they can hold on to, because I think we are from a bubble class, right, of kind of global, or at least European citizens who have, even though I hate this phrase, but but it's true, because at least I don't know about you, but I usually feel closer to people from Europe, from all around Europe, wherever they are, from Bulgaria, from UK, from Italy, if they are rather the same, background and class as I am, then I feel to Czechs, from a completely different backgrounds and classes, right? I feel like then you kind of define the national identity, and it's more about the background you have and like the experience you have. But I feel like for many of the people who don't have the chance to actually build this, right, because they don't travel, they don't have the chance to get to know people. They might travel, but they don't have the chance to truly meet new people, live among them, get educated at a high level. And I don't think this is their fault, right? Like this is because of which conditions they were born to. Then, without religion, which was the glue for thousands of years, basically, and that served as the identity they could always relate to. Like, if they didn't have the national identity, what would they have left? Because they obviously, it's hard for them to build a global one or the European one, especially even without the languages. That's the basic barrier, I would say. And if you don't have the national one, that would be a massive emptiness for them. So I feel like for us, it's quite easy to say, nationalism has just these bad consequences and everything, and I agree with it. But for many people, I think their life would be actually quite scary without it, because then what do you relate to if you don't have that?
I agree. I would just say that I think nationalism is not the best, or is not a solution to the breakdown of community that we've noticed in the past, decades or even 100 years. I think that we need to think about how we used to relate to other human beings, and build communities that are closer to what used to be, or maybe even a third kind, something that's better, but that's not so that doesn't have so much potential for evil, maybe, as nationalism does, as has been demonstrated before.
Yeah, I see a lot of potential in local communities, actually, and I know, and many even economists and political scientists do as well, and I do think that it could be a good way to go forward, but it's a tough one. But well, coming back to your research here, which concerns Czech identity specifically, and I'm really interested in that. So, how has the current Czech identity been formed in the past centuries? It's obviously a long, complicated process, but what were the most important and significant and interesting parts of it?
So, if you look at, we first need to think a little bit about the history of nationalism, right? And also its different classifications. So as I've mentioned previously, nationalism, it first comes about shortly after the French Revolution, when, you have people are redefining class, that's one thing, or social order. And the other thing is that there is this, not on the same scale, but pretty much like during the First World War, there is kind of a mass conscription of French young men, I think aged 20 to 25, shortly following the French Revolution under the Third Republic. And so you have all these people who come from very different backgrounds that are told to come together under the banner of the Republic of France. And that kind of spurs the idea of national belonging, and defines national identity in political and also military, mainly political terms, right? Which is these are young men who are going to become political agents. They're going to become voters, and these are all French. And so that's kind of like the first idea, and nationalism kind of emerges as a social and political current almost.
Mm-hmm.
And then that idea kind of like gains traction. And in, I think, 1809, you have the first milestone in the Czech national revival. So, not that long after the French Revolution, when you have like the first book of Czech grammar that's published.
That was a bad moment, because I'm a big hater of the Czech national revival.
Yes, so are most Czech people.
No, because I thought it would be so much better off if we just stay Germanized, but I was telling this to my dad and he got mad at me. but I do think so.
So that's kind of the beginning, and then there are several more milestones. Then you have Hanka, about him and his beautiful manuscripts that turned out to be completely made up. And then you have Jungmann and the Czecho-German dictionary, and then you have Palatsky with the history of the Czech people, or the history of the Czech nation, I think. But basically all of that shows, to me personally, as a historian, what it shows is that this is a primarily almost like, this is a movement that's almost entirely initiated by very educated men, And so then the question is, and the question that I'm trying to answer in my thesis, right, is, okay, but what did local people think?
Yeah, no one wanted it. That's the thing. Everyone would be better off if we stayed Germanized.
Well, without going so far, you kind of realize that nationalism also served a very real, like, economic and political purpose, right? It was in the interest of certain people to awaken national consciousness so that they could have more political power. They could redistribute economic power also differently in the region, etc., etc. And then when you look at kind of your average folk, it's kind of, they don't feel that strongly about national identity. Unsurprisingly, it's a concept to them that's like a little bit foreign. And like, it obviously is much easier to spread the idea of nationalism and national belonging in the middle classes, right? They have access to newspapers, they have they have better connections, they might be able to, go to consume and enjoy culture, all of that. So they're kind of more able to keep abreast of developments in the political, social, cultural and economic areas where nationalism is kind of at its strongest. And people who are more busy going about their daily lives don't really have time or desire to concern themselves with that. So they define their identities either on a local scale, be like, I'm from this region, or even I'm from this community, I'm from this village, or on a much larger political scale. I belong to this empire, or I belong to this state, not necessarily to this idea of like an ethnic nation as well, or a linguistic nation. So studying nationalism, you can even see that people at the time realized that something that we take for granted now, people back then realized was just not, it wasn't something that they felt was very real, because that's not a tool necessarily that they used to define themselves.
And so what is the backbone of Czech nationalism? Because is it the language? Is it the, what was it built on actually? Because the notion that we have some history, like, is that enough?
So that's the question, right? There are different types of nationalism, or like two main kinds. one of them is political. So there would be like the French or British example, right? And then you have kind of like linguistic.
Yeah, it's kind of lame to have linguistic nationalism, to be honest.
I mean, it's just like a very specific context, right? If you like France or Britain and you've been able to maintain territorial integrity for a really long time, then it's easier to just engage in some kind of political nationalism. But if you're a smaller country, or if you're Germany and you're scattered into lots of little kingdoms, then building national identity based on a political entity is extremely difficult, right? So the sense of belonging also, or like the way that you build the community is going to be different. And, we see that all around the world today. There is also nationalism that's based on religious affiliations, right? In some countries. And so, yeah, I don't think it's very context dependent. Most is what it is. So it's like kind of taking the idea of nationalism and saying, okay, how can it apply to you? And whatever works, you make it happen. So in this case, in the Czech case, it was language. Also for other reasons, right? For instance, like the idea that maybe Slovaks are Czechs. If you go the linguistic route, that works a little bit better than the territorial one, because of historical developments. So, there are a lot at the end of the day, because it's a romantic ideal, and some people just believe in it as like this beautiful, community of like-minded people where there is fairness, right? There are these people, but there are also people who are a bit more pragmatic, and they see it as like a means towards an end. And so for these people, it's easier to kind of just think about it in a more practical way.
And what do you for you personally, what's the most interesting thing about the Czech identity as such, and maybe the best and the worst of it? And not just, and that doesn't necessarily need to go so deep in history, right? That can be even recent developments and recent events.
I think it's a bit of a tricky one, right? Because it kind of implies some kind of comparative element. So I need to think about it for a little bit. Do I even have any of these? You know what? I think what attracted me to the study of Czech nationalism, amongst other things, is to see, and that's something that's like kind of, it's a recurring theme, but the idea of being at the center of something, how the elite of a linguistic community that doesn't even have a state somehow kind of like is building the narrative of being the center of a civilization, the center of a continent, and kind of like building that idea from scratch. To me, that's kind of like, there's something weirdly admirable about it. It's really ambitious, I think, as a project. So that's quite interesting. Already, during the 1848 revolutions, you have this idea of like, what is today, the Czech Republic being the heart of Europe in some like deep and meaningful, really significant way. And like, that's kind of interesting to me, coming from, maybe because I come from, a much larger country that doesn't have the kind of, the same history, the same journey, like coming from a country that's much older, right? If you think about the fact that the Czech Republic, or the Czech state didn't emerge until 1918. That's quite cool. So that passion is definitely interesting, and much fun. And then I think the worst thing is I think it's the worst is as with every other kind of nationalism, which is that at its core, you know, it builds a sense of belonging on some kind of othering, and it also places the nation on this pedestal. You know, the nation existed before you, it will exist long after you, and it obliterates it obliterates the value and meaning of individual human lives, because what are they in comparison to the greatness of the immortal nation? I think that's it's a very toxic, dangerous idea.
And do you see something specific about the Czech identity today, and not even necessarily with the prism of nationalism, like a nationalist ideology, just the traits you observe, if you can generalize like that?
You mean in people, or in
and the country, and how the country functions, how the people behave, like whether you see something that's very specifically Czech in your perception?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I have anecdotal, you know, I have anecdotal experiences with specific people, but nothing specifically that I can think of.
I think because I think I would have stuff to tell about the French, right? Like that would be some pretty generalizable things.
Okay.
And then I'm curious whether you have the same here, but apparently not. Okay, that's cool. And do you actually final things about the identities as such? So do you think that national identities can actually predispose a nation for some sort of success or failure? And I know it doesn't need to be, the linguistic definition of the nation, but maybe more of the cultural definition here, right? I'm thinking more of, the Protestant ethics in the Anglo-Saxon world, right? And there's like a massive connection found there between this and then, the economic and technological success throughout the Industrial Revolution, for example, right? Because this was one of the contributors to it. Obviously, it's hard to track the causation, correlation of it, but yes. But do you think that these national differences can actually define how a nation behaves? Or do you think that we cannot make this generalization at all?
I'm not entirely sure. I actually had not heard about this, what do you call it? Protestant ethics and the success of industrialization. That's my first time hearing about it.
It's super fascinating, actually. If you, it's you can. It's quite funny to observe, where Protestantism. Yeah, that's the English word, right?
Yeah.
Where the boundaries of it end in Europe, and where Catholicism starts to dominate, and then you look at GDP in these regions today per capita, and like you obviously it's not enough to, but it's like it's a pretty strong correlation, actually. Yeah.
I think. It's not. I don't think it's quite an answer to your question, but I think one thing that I found really interesting is also the idea of national decay, and I think it's an idea that's quite politically relevant, right? Even today, it's these nations that, like, for lack of a better word, have peaked. It's done, they've had their moment, and now these people are told that they belong to this community that was so much greater in the past than it is now. And I think that influences the way that political leaders behave, having to deal with the aftermath of, okay, we used to be great, we're not so good now, we'll never be that good again. And what do you do with that? And I think, that's kind of is what you see a little bit in Turkey. You see it in Russia. I think you see it also in Hungary recently, right?
Yeah, I mean France and England as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But
oh yeah,
Orban,
Hungary
you know,
for sure.
who wore
Absolutely.
this, was it a scarf
Yeah,
or
yeah,
this
yeah,
pin?
scarf, big Hungary, or large Hungary scarf, or great
Yes,
Hungary scarf.
yeah, with Greater Hungary is just, but yeah, and also I think, you know, in Austria, you also, if you go to Vienna, you have all this past, you know, like all this grandiose monuments erected that are symbols of what Vienna used to be, which is the capital of an empire. And now it's, you know, this really like quiet town.
Yeah. No, but you know what, I feel like, at least at least that's the impression I get, but I feel like the Austrians have managed it kind of the best out of the former empires. I don't feel like they suffer from the complex of we were once great. I feel, you know, compared to Hungarians, which are they would have the same right to feel like that, right? Because they, like Hungarians, they lost the majority of their land, and I don't know. I don't feel any grievances coming from them really. I feel like they put up with it, but that might be just my impression.
Yeah, no, that's true. And you know, you see it with you mentioned like France and the UK. I think like if you look at, I mean, I'm a historian, I'm not a political scientist, but I think if you look at like French diplomacy today, I think a lot of it is also, you know, about having a chip on your shoulder. And so I think that's kind of interesting to see how nationalism is also creating its own problems for itself through this idea of, you know, what used to be, what always will be, and how are political leaders supposed to deal with that? I think that's quite interesting.
But the idea of national decay is actually really interesting. And when I'm thinking about it, you know, and drawing up on what you mentioned before about the Czech narrative. So the fact that some random guy comes 200 years ago, creates this completely made up narrative about the Czech Republic being at the heart of Europe, and we were once the great Moravian, you know, empire, and the merchant Samo was the leader of it, and it was great, and we were the mightiest force of the continent, right? And then, you know, 200 years later, this influences politics, you know, at that time, and it influences how people feel. It's kind of unbelievable. I know, I'm always like amazed by it as well. And then people feel like, yeah, we were once these completely unrelated people 2,000 years ago, which lived in a similar area, but also in many other areas, because like this great Moravian empire was huge, right? These were my predecessors and they were great, so I should be great as well. Or like, what is the idea behind it? I'm always quite stunned by how this works, but it works somehow. It still works. It's quite fun. Okay, so we talked about national identities, but how, you know, it's quite rare for a French citizen, you know, who studied in the UK to know so much about Czech identity. So let's look into your personal story of how you got to this.
Okay.
So how does one become an expert on Czech identity? What is it? How does that begin? And take it all the way from the beginning.
Okay. So I think my interest in kind of Eastern and Central Europe predates my interest in the Czech Republic or Czech history specifically. So I'm going to give you it's a question that I get asked quite a lot. So I'm going to give you the full rundown so you have all of it.
Give me a whole long story, like when you started at high school. How did you even go to the UK and all the details?
Okay, so when I was, I've only ever attended, you know, like standard French, you know, public schools, we would call them. I mean, yeah, or state schools. That's what we should call them. And when I was in high school, maybe in France, high school was only 3 years. So maybe in my first or second year, I really wanted to study Russian history, actually. I really liked contemporary history, so I wanted to study kind of communist Russia or like Soviet Russia. And then I was like looking into it, and you know, like a historian historians' work heavily depends on the kind of skills that they have linguistically, because you need to be able to like read official documents, you need to be able to read private correspondence, so you need to have language skills. And I could not, I mean, I was maybe like 15, 16, and I just didn't have it in me to learn the Cyrillic alphabet. I just was not, it just was not a match. So I was like, okay, I probably should study something that's a bit more accessible. And around that time, my dad gave me a book by Milan Kundera. And so he was like, oh, I hear this guy is really good. And it was The Art of the Novel. And I read it and I enjoyed it. And my dad was like, this guy's quite good. So I was like, okay, let me find out what else he's written. And then I started reading about, I started reading his other novels. And I quite enjoyed them. And I was like, okay, what about studying communist Czechoslovakia? That might be like a little bit easier, you know, than all this Cyrillic alphabet thing. And so that's kind of how it started. And then when I did my undergraduate degree in London, because I didn't really feel at home in France and I wanted to try something new.
Why didn't you feel at home in France? Because that's actually many of my French friends who studied in London say that.
I think it's just, every society has its kind of codes for social interactions. And I think for young adults and teenagers, France's social codes are quite harsh and restrictive. And the UK's has this, or had, maybe it still has it, had this reputation, you know, for being this place that's a lot freer in terms of like social norms than France was. So I think that's why for a lot of us, the UK became this kind of, you know, beacon for, I don't know, they have social freedom.
And what do you think are these restrictive norms that you've struggled with in France?
I think, you know, it's, I felt when I was a teenager that French society was like incredibly judgmental. You know, there is like what is done and what isn't done. And the way that also, you know, it's like we are closer to Latin neighbors. So it's very, you know, like people interact a lot, people smile and they laugh and they make chit chat. But, you know, at the end of the day, people don't really know or necessarily like each other. So there's a lot of gossiping and silent or not so silent judging of one another. And I think, you know, that's kind of, when you're a teenager and you have all these ideals. Oh, I had all these ideals. I was like, that's not for me. I don't want to live in this society where we all like smile and make chit chat and then we badmouth each other. I'm emigrating. So then I moved to London for my undergraduate degree. And I wanted to take history classes, or history modules as they're called. But it was a bit complicated because I was studying German as my compulsory kind of like language component in my degree. So I tried to like kind of make sense of my university's requirements for something that would be German language related and my interest in Czechoslovakia. And at the end of the day is kind of the happy middle ground that I found was Austria-Hungary, which used to be a German-speaking state, but incorporated Czech and Slovak history. And then slowly I ended up going like further and further into the past. And now I'm slowly climbing my way back through the chronology. So I did my master's dissertation on the 1848 revolution, and now my current dissertation is from 1867 until 1918, 1920. So that's kind of how it happened.
I mean, what attracted you to these topics in the first place? I guess it's, I don't know. I cannot imagine just, you know, thinking when I'm 16, okay, this region and its history. That's what I want to focus on. That's interesting. You know, and why?
You mean why this specific region?
Yeah, but why in general you thought that, you know, studying history of some region and then this specific region makes, you know, it makes sense for you?
To be honest, I think, like, to be entirely truthful, I do think that some of it was it's just a series of decisions that get you somewhere. You know, the third layer of explanations. Things just happened because of contingency. And it was just one thing led to another, and here we are in 1914. And I think that's also, you know, what happens to a certain degree in all of our lives, that at some point it's just a bunch of like small decisions that you make, or small incidents that happen, small events in your life that bring you to where you are. And to me, that ended up being, you know, the history of Central Europe, and then the history of national identity, and then because of new interests, environmental history. So yeah, I think some of these things, maybe ask me in 10 years and I'll be able to tell you a bit more, but right now it's still a little bit obscure.
Yeah. And okay, and then you went on to your PhD to Oxford, and
exactly,
and moved here to Prague.
Yes.
That was how many years ago?
That I started my PhD, or that I moved to Prague?
Moved to Prague.
I moved to Prague in June 2021.
Okay.
So that's like a year and a half ago.
So that was mostly after COVID already?
Yes.
And in the meantime, you were in Oxford?
I was in Oxford for my first year, 2019. I started my PhD. And then the pandemic happened 6 months after I'd started, and then I went home. And then I actually got awfully depressed. And so I had to hit pause on my studies for a bit, and I spent that time at home trying to get better. And then I spent a little bit more time in Oxford, and then I moved here for research purposes, because obviously writing on the Czech history is more convenient to be where your sources are. So Prague is quite good for that.
And you know, why do you actually like doing what you do?
So what it is that I do, so I research, I write, and I teach. And I think I have slightly different motivations for all of these. I think research, and I think that's why, you know, you should do what we all have different qualities, and that's when it comes in handy. Like I just love learning new things. I don't really, I mean, obviously I do prefer learning things about national identity in Central Europe, clearly, because that's my PhD thesis. But I just really enjoy finding out new things in general and thinking critically about text that I read and trying to reconstruct a narrative and like tell a story. And so that, I think that's why I really enjoy the researching part of my PhD program. And then writing, that one's a little bit trickier. I used to love writing and even write in my spare time. Now, I think that's the part that I like the least because it's the trickiest. But I still just overall quite enjoy, you know, like defending the story that I come to in the research bit of my PhD. And then I think at the end of the day, I am a little bit more of a people person. And I think teaching has been one of my favorite, like my absolute favorite part of doing a PhD. You know, like sharing knowledge with others, but also, you know, it can be quite a lonesome pursuit to do a PhD in the humanities, because it's not like you're going to a lab where you can hang out with fellow physicists or whatever. you're kind of like by yourself with a stack of old papers, and that's just a little bit sad. So teaching is kind of like giving me the human contact that I need in a job. So that's really nice. And also, you know, by discussing themes that are related to what I do, or directly my thesis when I do presentations or seminars, etc., that is also like really enriching to exchange with somebody and hear the questions that they might have that you didn't even think of, and you're like, oh, that's actually a really good point, I should definitely look into that. So I think a very enjoyable experience overall, I would.
And do you do what you do because you find, you know, some greater meaning in it, or because you but because you actually enjoy it and you're passionate about it, or is it both?
I think a little bit of both. I don't think that I'm going to change the world with my research. But I think, you know, I think by generating knowledge, I am contributing to the lives of like at least a few other scholars, but also, you know, to a project that's greater than me, right? The project of like understanding the world around us, which is like, I think one of humanity's greatest projects. So that's definitely something that I think about sometimes, you know, like it feels quite good to think that, yeah, it's not just me. As I said, PhDing can be quite lonesome.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you know, there was one more thing I had on my mind was, you know, whether the whole topic of what you do and focusing on identity so much, on nationalism and on history. Do you think it was influenced by your roots, actually, by the fact that, you know, your identity is from a nationalist point of view is quite complicated, right? Like you were born in France, you have an Algerian parent, it's your dad, right? Yeah. You then you moved away and everything. So do you think that had a mark on why you actually went down this path?
I think it's definitely a possibility. Yeah. I also think, you know, I could have decided to study French history or even Algerian history, but I think it felt both more interesting but also safer to study a country that was entirely unrelated to my own identity, but would also, in a sense, enable me to understand how national identities are formed and what it means to belong to a national community. I mean, I don't think it's that straightforward, but I think coming to terms with my dual nationality, I think I'm realizing that there are benefits to studying or researching what I research. That can help me to make sense of some things in my personal life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And have you ever actually been somehow internally divided because of this you know, multipolar origin of you? Have you maybe struggled with finding what your identity actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, when I have my last name, so Nabi, it is quite recognizably Muslim, or at the very least North African, to other Muslim or North African people. But then I look the way that I do, which for the people who are listening to the podcast and actually will see my photo, like extremely, I just look like a normal white person. So there was always, you know, this kind of disconnect already between my family name, from which I inherited from my dad, my Algerian dad, and the way that I look. But also, you know, I grew up in a very multicultural, multi-ethnic, like multiracial community. in France. So I had like lots of black and brown kids around me growing up, from like some of them from with Algerian parents as well, or other parts of North Africa. And I did sometimes feel like a little bit of a fraud because I didn't look like them. And I also, you know, I didn't have, only one of my parents was Algerian, so I felt like I wasn't quite the same. And that was tricky for me to kind of like make sense of that part of my identity because of these obstacles. In a way, you know, I felt like, and at some point I just stopped saying that I was a Franco-Algerian. I would just be like, yeah, I'm French. And I would just leave it at that because it felt like sometimes it felt like I just didn't have a reason to say it. Sometimes it felt like I didn't want to say it. And sometimes it felt like I didn't have the right to say it. So it's been kind of like a little bit difficult, especially I think, you know, because I personally have not experienced in a French context like the racism that a lot of other people with one or two Algerian parents who look a lot more Algerian than me do. So it's kind of like, it's a bit difficult. I feel like it's almost distasteful, you know, in a way, to be like, oh yeah, I'm the same, but also I have no problems because I just look super white like my mum. So yeah.
And do you feel Czech now? To some extent?
No, not at all. It's actually, you know, it's actually interesting because I've lived in the UK and I've lived in the Czech Republic, and I have actually realized it is incredibly difficult to integrate into another national community. I used to think, oh, if you speak the language and you look the part, you're going to be... No, that's not enough. And I think these have been very enriching experiences, but also, no, I think I've neither in the UK nor in the Czech Republic have I felt like I belonged to my host community, so to say.
What do you think is the hardest one here? Like, when you say like this, like just that's not me, or like this I cannot get used to, or are these all intangible, soft things you cannot really, you know, specify into concrete details?
I think it's just, you know, the cultural, all the like cultural heritage that you've accumulated, or like most people here have accumulated for like 18 years. I just will never have it. And so the way that what people find funny, I went to the theatre yesterday, and I mean, it's a bit controversial, but there was this, it was Horduval. It was the premiere of like an adaptation or like a play inspired by Horduval, and there was this gypsy Roma character, and she said "Vidím velký špatný," and everybody erupted into laughter. And I was like, what is funny? Is it because it's not proper Czech? And it turns out everybody will know probably that listens to this is because there was this famous Roma fortune teller who read cards, and she would say "Vidím velký špatný," and so people found that funny. And I wouldn't know. And these are the little things that kind of remind you that you just did not share the same cultural background. You just do not quite belong here, even if you try and speak Czech, which I sometimes do, even if you understand it mostly. So.
Okay. Okay. And what do you actually like most and least? Like, would there be something that would come to your mind?
Where do I love most and like least? I think I actually quite enjoy the fact that overall most Czech people are quite outdoorsy. because I didn't really grow up in a very outdoorsy family. So for me, it's like, it's quite nice to like be with people who are like quite active and like curious and want to go explore, and like I think that's really nice and healthy. And I think it's not something that I like least, but one thing that I think I miss being here, especially after having lived in London and being originally from like a culturally diverse community in France, is like the cultural diversity.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's like quite culturally homogeneous, even here in Prague.
I miss that a lot as well.
Yeah, and I
Compared
think
to London.
yeah, so I think that's not something to dislike per se, but it's something that I could definitely appreciate more of.
And I always ask people this question, and it's very interesting to hear their responses to it, and that is, what has driven you throughout the whole journey, basically? What has been the engine that you have followed?
Oh, that's interesting. I think it's changed throughout my life, but I think, like one of them that I've mentioned before is curiosity. Just like loving learning facts, which is quite, it's not everyone, but that's been me. I think sometimes it's also been thinking about, like my family and like my family history and like my ancestors, people might say, like not necessarily 100 years ago, but just even like grandparents and great-grandparents, and thinking about the lives that they had. That's been sometimes really helpful for me to think about. And then I think sometimes it was just, like just a vision that I had for myself, what I wanted, the kind of life that I wanted to have. And when all else failed, I think that was the last kind of my last resort reason was like, okay, what do I want for myself in the next 60 years that I have here?
What was the answer?
It's changed as well, but it's like I wanted, a stimulating career. I wanted also to be able to do and afford certain things, right? So like wanting to, as a woman, maybe like have a family, but also wanting to travel and all these kinds of things. So like I think imagining, thinking, okay, where do I want to be? That's helped as well, I think.
And have there been some values or ideas that you have followed the whole time, like that have been defining you, that were most important to you? Really mostly about the values, actually. Have you been thinking about that?
I actually had a conversation recently about justice and friendship. And I think I have quite a strong sense of what justice and fairness means for me. And I think that's one value, or like that might even be the most important value for me. And sometimes I think it evens, like, yeah, sometimes it even, like leads me to maybe behave with less grace towards friends and family, because I'm like, no, I think I should just do what's just and fair and not what sentimentality or like feelings dictate. So.
And are you confident to say that you're right and what's just and fair?
Probably not. But I just, in some clear-cut situations, I just have a strong, I just think it's really important. And I think if it comes down to sacrificing a little bit of niceness for the sake of a little bit more, fairness, then I will definitely choose that.
Okay. And are you looking forward to the future?
Ooh, yeah, yeah, I think so. You know, like, I mean, that's kind of, it's a bit cheesy, but isn't that kind of all that we have at this point? You know, we can't go back to the past. The present is fleeting. So kind of like the future is what you should be excited about. So yeah, I'm quite excited. I'm going to finish my thesis, hopefully find a postdoc position somewhere nice. And yeah, I'm excited to see where I end up, you know. Like,
where would that be, the postdoc position?
So I'm applying in a few countries, but ideally, you know, somewhere in Europe. So maybe the UK, maybe Germany or Austria.
Not Czech Republic?
Maybe. maybe, you never know. But yeah, and you know, like, we'll see. Like, life is also made up of the lucky moments and the contingency. So we'll see what contingency life throws my way next.
Okay. And then, you know, for the final part, we always talk about the younger generation a bit more. What would you like your, I don't know, 15 or even 20-year-old you to know that you know now, but you didn't at that time? What do you think would have helped you?
I think one thing would definitely be you have time. I think, you know, like, maybe especially women and girls, like, we feel like we don't have time. And I would say, you know, like, you have so much time. You don't need to stress, like, 1 year when you're 16, 17, 18, 1 year feels like so much, because it is compared to how much you've lived. But, like, you have time, and that also means you have time to try things, and you have time to make mistakes, and you have time to change your mind. And I think a lot of, when you're a teenager, you have a lot of pressure to, like, choose something and commit now. And I'm like, I think it's important to realize that you don't have to do that. I think that's quite helpful, to realize that, you know, like, you can pursue something and try to see if it works. And if it doesn't work, even if you spent a year on it, maybe even 2 years on it, that's okay. I think you always end up learning from whatever it is that you do, in good ways, and not just the fact that it was the wrong thing for you, but just also, like, skills and knowledge that is always useful. So yeah, that would be one thing. Like, don't put too much pressure on yourself. You have a lot of time. You can experiment. You don't have to commit.
And the absolute final thing, you know, that has to do with history. So we can come back to history, full circle. So what do you think that people, about young people, but maybe even older people, should should they think about history and about the past and about how people lived, and what should they take from it? What maybe that you have taken from it and you seem like it's extremely valuable?
I think that we've already touched upon this a little bit, but that would be definitely that kind of history is a story. It's a story that we tell from one or more perspectives, but there is always somebody that we're not hearing, or somebody that is being silent, or somebody that we don't bother finding out about. And I think that's, it's always worth asking yourself who that is and why. So that would be one thing. Was the question about what What was the question? How did you phrase it?
Yeah. The first one, the first part you answered. So how we should think about history.
Yeah.
But then what we should take from it, like and maybe what you have taken from studying it extensively, right? In general.
I think the one thing that history has taught me would be what I've mentioned before, like critical thinking. And I think what you can take away from it as well is seeing how it kind of like really helps you relativize a lot of things, right? When you think about how we used to think about women, how we used to think about shell shock, how we used to think about colonial soldiers. And that was not that long ago, right? That was just a little over 100 years ago. I think that also can prompt us to think about our current beliefs and be like, okay, what are we taking for granted? What are the paradigms here that we're not seeing? What is the bigger picture? Does all of it make sense? And I think that can be very enriching and also quite fun.
Okay, so the hope that even the bad beliefs, the bad established orders can be gradually, and maybe will be gradually, like replaced by something better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. That's a good message to end with. So thank you. It's been great. It's been a really fun episode. You're really fluent and like very easy to listen to. I love that. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Yaku. Had a great time with you.